First past the post has been the way we elect governments in Canada from the day we started running elections. It's the only democratic part of government we have nationally and provincially. From there on, the party that garnered the most seats wins all of the power. That's where democracy ends. From that point onward, neither you nor your elected representative has any real power in government. The power rests solely in the hands of the Prime Minister nationally and premiers provincially. If they want to pass a bill, it will get passed because their party members are obligated to support the bill. As an MLA or MP, the best you can do is take the concerns of your constituents to the leader. If the leader is set on their agenda, the MLA cannot vote against the bill without consequences. Maria Dobrinskaya is campaigning to encourage you to vote in favour in the provincial referendum on proportional representation. She points to the inaccurate way first past the post represents voters. She asks, why should a party that gets 40% of the vote get 100% of the power? We invited Maria Dobrinskaya to join us for a conversation that matters about the case for changing how we vote to one of proportional representation.
Conversations That Matter is a partner program for the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's my pleasure because we're sort of wading into the confusing territory of proportional representation. I've read about it, I've tried to understand it, I've tried to make sense of it. The moment somebody starts to ask me to start to explain it, my ability to transfer what I think I understand to somebody else as being a credible option, it plummets. And in some ways, that's the knock against proportional representation. First past the post, I can describe quite easily.
Well, we have the lived experience of voting under it and
this is true.
It. Yeah.
This is true. How do you describe? Give me your overview. This is my elevator pitch on proportional representation. Then we'll sort of look at the different aspects.
Yeah. So I like to make a distinction between proportional representation being complicated versus it being unfamiliar. And given that over 90 countries throughout the world use a form of proportional representation. I don't think personally that British Columbians are less equipped to understand a voting system that is used by so many other democracies in the world. But it is definitely unfamiliar. I think that if you tried to explain first past the post to people who weren't living within that system, it would also be similarly confusing. At its core, proportional representation is simple. It's essentially 40% of the vote should equal 40% of the seats, so that the popular vote should be reflected in the composition of the legislature. There are many paths to get there, and so what we see throughout the world essentially is different forms of proportional representation in their system or jurisdiction, depending on what works best. What's on offer here are three different paths to proportional outcomes. So if we understand that proportionality at its core is 40% equals 40%, it's also important for us to understand some of the common outcomes. So in the Attorney General's report, he's identified that no region of the province will lose MLA. So we know that no region of the province is going to have fewer MLAs than they currently do. And I know that that was a concern for many people with the STV referenda previously. We also know that the legislature is not going to increase by more than 10%, if at all. So we're looking at anywhere from 87 MLAs that we currently have up to 95, but we're not going to see a larger increase than that based on the regulations as they exist.
It would only come as there is a population
there may be more
the way that it has anyway.
Exactly, with elections like the Electoral Boundaries Commission, and those processes are decided outside of government, and they're based on census data and population growth. The third thing that we know is that there's a 5% threshold. So a party has to be able to demonstrate 5% of the popular vote in order to elect somebody to the legislature, and that threshold is determined to essentially keep out fringe parties and to establish a threshold, which frankly 5% is a fairly, it sounds like a low amount, but it's quite hard to do that province-wide. The fourth thing that I think is really important here, and goes to your initial question around how do we understand this, is that after 2 elections under proportional representation, we will have another referendum to determine whether or not it's working for us. And I think it's really telling that jurisdictions that have moved to proportional representation have not gone back to first past the post. And I think the opportunity for us to try it in real time, to understand what our ballots look like, to see what the composition of government looks like, is really important. I mean, I think there's certain people who do not want to explore the option of proportional representation, and I'm glad we're having a referendum and they can have their say. For the many people who I think are curious, who understand some of the frustrations of our democracy, who don't like living in a safe seat, who don't like seeing MLAs toe the party line when they said something else on a campaign trail, and recognize that there's room for improvement in how we elect our politicians, but are concerned and confused, I think that provides a really important reassurance for us to go back to. So sorry, go ahead.
No, please, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, if we understand sort of the concept of proportionality, and we're clear on some of those outcomes, then we can see the three systems as different paths to get there. So all three systems are mixed.
Right.
And so that's important to mention, because what that means is essentially we're maintaining our local MLAs. So our first vote in virtually all three systems is the same as it is now. It's for our local MLA. And how it differs beyond that is, what is the mechanism for determining how we reach proportionality?
One of my knocks against the current system is that we cannot take a look at it and call it truly representational democracy.
Yes.
But on the other hand, I look at the system in the United States, which is much closer to a representational democracy, because you have a senator and you have a congressional representative, both at the state and at the national level. And they are not necessarily bound to vote along party lines.
Exactly. You see a lot more sort of independence and freedom even amongst Democrats or Republicans there, for sure.
They're not going to get kicked out of the party because their constituents say to them, we don't care what your stand is on that, we don't want it. They know they need to get reelected, and so they are going to listen to their constituents. Can we ensure, though, because I look at the morass that happens, especially at the national level in the United States, that we're not going to fall into that stagnant kind of leadership that we see so cumbersomely move through legislation. So
there's trade-offs in every voting system. I think that you've highlighted that sort of the independence of representatives that I think many of us would like to see more of. There's going to be trade-offs in any electoral system. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that everything will be solved in our democracy if we change our voting system.
We're not going to nirvana.
Exactly. I mean, I think there's way too much hyperbole on both sides of the discussion that's actually depriving us of having an informed decision about democracy. So yes, there are trade-offs. I think one of the questions that we need to look at is, are those trade-offs worth it? I think that there is a lot of, there's been criticism of instability or inability to get things done. And there's also criticism, I think, correctly on the flip side around majority governments who are not representative, under first past the post, who don't represent the majority of citizens, getting things done by ramming through legislation that's not necessarily in the collective interest of our province or of the people that they're there to represent. I also think there's a lot of myths around expediency, the lack of being able to get work done under proportional representation. So some of these are questions of value for voters. We want most decisions in government to be made by the executive branch. In 2013, I think it was, the legislature sat for about 36 days.
I think that most people don't realize that, and I saw it in your literature, that once elected, we live under essentially a dictatorship, because either it comes from the Premier's office or it comes from the Prime Minister's office, and they rule the country.
Yes, exactly.
Like the power that they have.
There's very few mechanisms in between elections, and even sometimes when elections come up, to challenge ideas. And we also have a dynamic when the opposition does challenge those ideas, as is their role in doing so, there's no space for altering things or amending things or sort of finding common ground. And most people, I think most voters generally, are not exclusively loyal to one party or another. They recognize that some parties they like the ideas coming from one side or from another side, but when there's no space, when it's black and white, right or wrong, when a government, will be attacked, frankly. Like, it's our political culture. I understand why governments won't take ideas from the opposition. I understand why opposition won't support government bills. There's no political gains for them in doing so. But voters, at the end of the day, citizens are who pay that price.
So when we take a look at the way that the House operates right now, yes, there is, public debate. There is, the House is in session.
The theater of question period.
Well, I think that that's the operative word right there. The theater of it, because it doesn't do much.
Yes,
it leads to a vote that's predetermined anyways.
Exactly. There's very few situations, unless they're a free vote, unless there's some sort of weird dynamic going. There are exceptions.
It can happen.
But the rule is generally that it is an exercise. And you get good questions. I think that the work that's carried out in the legislature, even under our current system, is very important because we get government on the record, we get opposition on the record. It's budget estimates are able to go line by line and hold the government to account, and we want that. But we want more of that. We want more transparency in how those decisions are made. And when parties need to work together, they hold each other in check, because power is not going to disappear from politics, right? People are still, I'm not suggesting that it's all happy and everybody's going to sit around and sing kumbaya. Everybody's going to be angling for their particular position and jostling within the political environment, but they're going to have to hold each other to account in doing so. And because of the way proportional representation works, in that what counts as the overall vote share, individual MLAs are going to have to pay a lot more attention to what their constituents want.
And so then you see not only the work that happens in committees, but also when the House sits, that there is going to be a more productive dialogue.
Yeah, I think they're going to be, I don't like to use that we're going to be forced to, but they're certainly going to be encouraged to. Like, I've had the opportunity to know a lot of folks running for public office. I have a lot of respect for anybody that puts their name out there. It's a hard job, and I think that part of my motivation in changing our voting system is actually to restore some respectability, frankly. People are increasingly alienated by politicians. They're turned off by politics in general. And I get it. And so these people go in, I think, with, for the most part, really good intentions, wanting to make a difference in their community or on a certain policy issue. And then they get there, and if they're not located in exactly the right position, they're likely to be really, really frustrated, or they're likely to be told by, discipline within their caucus or by their party around, here's our priorities. And when you have the ability for swing ridings to really determine the entire outcome of an election, so, 200 people in Courtney Comox essentially is what, this last election was a bit of an anomaly, which is why we're even having this referendum. But when there's such a narrow group of voters that are able to determine all of the power essentially for government for 4 years, who are the political parties campaigning to?
So you're incredibly passionate about this. Why? What got you so...
Well, okay, so I'll go back to my other point about knowing politicians, being fortunate to... I've been involved in politics for a long time. I actually really believe government matters and makes a difference in people's lives. And democracy is not static, right? We need to work it. It's a muscle. And if we don't work it, we'll lose it. And so I'm concerned about the fact that SFU put out SFU Center for Dialogue released a public poll a couple days ago where they surveyed Metro Vancouver on sort of their feelings about democracy. And over half of people don't feel well represented, don't think politicians represent their interests, don't think they have influence on government. Like, these are alarming statistics. Is proportional representation going to solve all of this? No, but we have an opportunity right now to not just adopt a new system, but I think the process of adopting a new system provides us with a great opportunity to reinvigorate our democracy and to have more conversations about how well things are working, how we want to be represented, and frankly, how we tackle the complex challenges that we're facing.
So, when this ballot, and this mail-in ballot goes out, it's going to ask you, are you happy with what we have? If you say no, in essence, you're saying no. Well, then here are three.
There are three. So getting back to the three systems.
So what are those three?
So there's three systems. As I mentioned, they're all mixed. So what that means is in all of them, you're voting first and foremost for a local MLA. With dual member, it is exactly as it sounds. It's combining 2 ridings and electing 2 MLA. So the first one is elected first past the post. Whoever gets the most votes wins. The second one will ensure proportionality. So on a regional basis, looking at you know, if the NDP won 3 seats, Liberals won 1, but the Liberals were 4 votes behind in all those other 3 ridings, well, they would likely get all of the so-called top-up MLAs. And how I like to describe dual member, it's probably the most simple in terms of the ballot we'll receive, but it also is a system that is most likely to elect independents. So if you're somebody who wants to elect more independents, that's a system that you might want to read more about. And I'll just say, Elections BC has a lot of information. Like, I will do the summaries. I don't think people need to dig in as much as some of them feel like they might, but I'm certainly wanting people to make an informed decision. The second one is mixed member, and that's the one that's probably most familiar to people. It's used in New Zealand, it's used in Germany, and several other countries. And essentially with mixed member, you elect the 60% of the MLAs in the legislature elected by the voters in the same way we do now.
Riding by riding.
Riding by riding. Yeah. The difference is the other 40% will be regional representatives. So again, regional ridings, and we can, you know, break up the province. I think there's not a huge amount of disagreement on what those regions would look like. And so similar to the first one, everybody would elect their MLA first and foremost, and then looking at how that played out and where there's gaps in the proportionality, the regional MLAs would compensate for that.
So the knock against that is, well, I don't know who those regional MLAs might be, and so then who am I voting for?
So this is the thing. So our position from the Vote PRBC campaign is that all MLAs should be put in the legislature by voters. And
you know who you're voting for.
You know who you're voting for.
So this is not your favorite.
Well, it is, because I think that there is one small aspect of it that could be closed lists. I think I'm not going to argue in favor of closed lists. Again, I think there's a lot of ways to achieve. One of the arguments for them is that it's a very good way of achieving more diversity. So when because parties will can essentially put their list forward to ensure that they're meeting diversity targets. But most of the ways that MMP works is that, yes, the party has a list, but voters get to pick from that list of regional candidates. So they would be voting for their local MLA, and instead of just voting for a party as their second vote would be voting for a regional candidate. What I will say is right now we have closed lists. So I know that there's a lot of concern about parties having undue amounts of control over who gets elected. Right now, parties basically determine who their candidates are. It's, in some situations, members will vote through a nomination process. In many, the leaders will appoint somebody, and there's a whole variety of ways in which that happens. I'm hopeful.
But you know what that name is when you're going into the voting booth.
Exactly. But what you're also limited to with that is if you like a party and you like the leader of that party, but you don't necessarily like the local MLA or the local candidate, or vice versa, you don't have any choice.
Handcuffed,
you don't have any choice. So in both of the situations I've described, you actually have a lot of choice. You can vote for a candidate with one party as your local MLA. You can vote for people on another party's list for the regional level. And so both of those offer more voter choice.
And the third choice?
The third choice is a hybrid choice. And so what the hybrid is essentially the mixed member, as I just described, for rural areas. So still they would elect a local MLA and then some regional MLAs, and the number of regional MLAs would vary depending on the population, but it's a way to ensure that we're strengthening rural representation, which was one of the big concerns as well with STV, single transferable vote.
Which is not on
well,
the ballot,
it is.
right?
The urban portion of urban PR is essentially a ranked ballot as STV.
Okay.
So that would mean in urban areas like Vancouver, there would be a very large ridings, and there would be multiple MLAs. So you would see 6 or 7. You would elect 6 or 7 MLAs potentially based on how big they determine the region. But you could rank them.
Well, it's not dissimilar from voting for councillors in the city of Vancouver.
Well, this is it. Anytime people say this is too confusing, I ask have you ever voted in a municipal election in Vancouver? In Vancouver, we don't get to rank, so right. We pick from a list, and it's essentially first past the post. It's instead of it's still a plurality,
But you're
system.
Picking multiple people.
Exactly. So with that last one, urban rural, it does provide the most voter choice, I would say. And then all three systems, one of the things that I think is quite interesting about the three systems on offer, because I know there's a bunch of criticisms around how they've been used or where they've been used. But they're all very particular to BC and pay a lot of attention to sort of the unique demographic and geographic particularities of our province. So the ensuring, I think that the feedback in the consultation, as well as the experience of the last referenda, we heard loud and clear from rural BC, like, this is not good for us. It's too big. We feel like we're losing representation. So
I know that there is money that's provided by the provincial government for both sides of this debate.
Yes.
Are you also getting support from anyone else, and do you need it?
Yeah, so in terms of the funding, I think it's an interesting question. So both sides, both the pro and the for and against, received $500,000, and then we have the ability to spend an additional $200,000 if we can raise it. And so that money is coming from individuals. So based on campaign finance laws in this province, there's no money from corporate or union donors. It has to be citizens of BC residing here, and they can donate up to $1,200. So we are actively fundraising. There's a lot of grassroots interest, frankly, in the campaign. Having said all that, even with $700,000, it's a lot of money. It's not when you look at a province-wide campaign, and you know, both of the major parties would spend more than that, frankly, on a swing riding in the course of a 1-month election campaign. I think it's really important here the role that Elections BC is playing.
Right.
And so in previous referenda, there was not the spending limits that we have now, but the trade-off, and I think this is actually a really important one, is that in this referendum, Elections BC is tasked essentially with the public education component. So you're going to see way more ads from Elections BC than from either the for or against side, and I think it's good and it's important because people are inherently distrustful of politics. They're distrustful of these sort of competing he said, she said messages they're getting from both sides. So getting information from a sort of neutral, independent, trusted source like Elections BC, I think is critical. And they've got materials translated into 17 different languages, and they're actively trying to ensure people are registered to vote and all that. So that's good.
So I got to wrap up.
Yes,
Just
sorry. I could talk about this for a long time, but I appreciate your time.
Yeah, one last thing to remind people is that it's 50 plus 1%. It's much lower threshold than when Gordon Campbell first went to the polls with this,
Yes.
and that would have passed if that had been
58% in 2005, but the threshold was 60. So yeah, 50% plus 1.
Yeah.
And and we'll see. I think there's a strong appetite for it. So.
Thank you for coming in.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.